Hey guys, real quick before we begin, I just want to let you know that I measure my success in students taught and not dollars earned. So when you get to the end of this video, please let me know if you've learned something new by either liking this video or subscribing to my channel. It keeps me motivated and helps me out a lot. If you have a topic you would like me to cover, let me know by leaving me a comment. And with that out of the way, let's get started. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the 3D viewport editor in Blender. Blender is a free program that you can get from blender.org. I've covered how to download and install Blender in a previous video, so if you don't have Blender, I recommend you check that out first. In my last video, we looked at the overall interface of Blender and how it's broken down. In this video, we get down even further into the nuts and bolts of Blender. Today, we will just look at the 3D viewport editor. We will cover the layout and context sensitivity, modes and menus, the view button, the buttons next to the view button, the toolbar and tool settings, controls, display and shading, and the side panel, or the end panel as some people call it. The 3D viewport is the main editor that takes up most of the screen on a new project. Since we're not going to be looking at the other editors at all today, let's hide them by maximizing the 3D viewport. We can do that by pressing Ctrl Spacebar. If you hover your mouse over an editor and press that shortcut, it will maximize that editor. If the editor is already maximized, it will return it to its default size. So I can quickly maximize and reset these editors like this. I'll keep the 3D viewport maximized for now. The 3D viewport has a header in its top section. This gives us access to the various tools we will need and a bottom section where we will use those tools. It also has a toolbar and a side panel. The side panel is hidden by default. We can unhide it by pressing N on our keyboard, which is why it is sometimes referred to as the N panel. You can hide or show the toolbar panel by pressing the T key. Before we get into any more details, I need to talk about context sensitivity. Now, what is context sensitivity? Context sensitivity simply means that things will behave differently depending on what we have selected. For example, if I select this camera and click on Object Mode in this drop-down menu, you'll notice that there's nothing else here. Why did they put a drop-down menu when there's only one item? Seems absurd, right? Well, if we click on this cube and go back to the drop-down menu, it now has this plethora of modes we can select. So the interface will change depending on what we have selected. And it goes far beyond just selecting objects. Things will change depending on what mode or even what tool we have selected. Therefore, if something is not appearing or your screen looks different than mine, make sure you have selected the right thing. Now let's get back on track. Modes allow us to edit an object in different ways. The default mode for all objects is Object Mode, which allows us to change macro level properties like the object's position, rotation, and scale. But some objects have more than one mode, like this cube, as we've seen before, which has all of these. If I add a grease pencil stroke and go back to this drop-down menu, you'll see that it now has a draw mode, which is a mode exclusive to the grease pencil strokes and allows us to make new strokes. Now let's undo that for now and click back on our cube for a second. If we switch to edit mode, which we can get to quickly by pressing the tab key, we'll get to edit more micro level properties like the individual vertices of the object. Pose mode, which is a mode exclusive to armatures, as well as edit mode, both support multi-object editing. To demonstrate this, I'll add another object. Don't worry too much about how I'm doing this. We'll learn more about this later. Okay, now I'll select both of them by holding down left click and dragging a box around them. Then press tab to switch to edit mode. As you can see, I can edit both of them at the same time. There are more modes, but don't worry about those for now. Let's switch back to object mode. To the right of the modes drop-down menu is the view button that lets us change things about the view. This is a pretty common button to editors, but not all editors have them. In the 3D viewport, regardless of what mode you're in, you'll always see this view button. It has some buttons that are very common, and you'll be using them a lot, especially these viewport buttons, which allow you to switch to different views, although it's best to use the shortcuts, which are just the number pad keys. 1, 3, and 7 will snap your camera to the front, right, or top view. If you hold down Control while pressing these keys, it'll do the opposite. It'll switch you to the back, left, or bottom view. 9 will flip you to the opposite side. If you're looking at the front, 9 will spin you around to the back. Play around with this menu and get to know the shortcuts. We'll be using them in future videos, and they're very common. One of my favorites is the walk navigation. It's under View, Navigation, Walk Navigation at the very bottom. It lets you walk around the scene using your mouse to look around and WASD to move, just like you're playing a first-person shooter. You really can't get any more intuitive than that. As always, press right-click to cancel. There's also a fly navigation you'll definitely want to try out. We'll get into proper scene navigation in another video. The buttons to the right of View are context sensitive. As we've shown earlier, they will change depending on what mode we are in. Since we are in object mode, they manipulate data at the object level. There are a lot of them, and going over each of them for each mode would make this video several hours long, so just know that they are there and have a look at them. Try changing the modes and see what appears. They are mostly self-explanatory, and remember, you can always hover your cursor over them to get more information. We'll be using these a lot in the future, and I'll explain them at that point in time, so don't worry if you don't get it right now. Below the Modes drop-down menu, we have the toolbar. If you don't see the toolbar, press T on your keyboard. That will hide and unhide it, if I haven't mentioned that already. I have. These tools are also in the buttons to the right of View, but they are so common that the good people at Blender have brought them out so we can access them quickly. You can also left-click and drag to change its layout. If we drag just a little bit to the left, it becomes 2 columns. If we drag out a little bit more, it'll show the labels. If we drag it to the left, it will completely disappear. For now, let's just keep it at the default location. In the header, you'll see another set of context-sensitive buttons called the Tool Settings. If you don't see this menu, go to View and make sure the Tool Settings checkbox is checked. They are context-sensitive based on the current tool we have selected. If we select the Annotate tool, we get settings to help us place where the annotation will go. If we select the Rotation tool, we will get settings that will change how the Rotation tool works. If I select a cube and orbit around it, you'll notice how the rotation gizmo doesn't change as I move around. It's fixed in space like a normal object. However, if I change the rotation's orientation settings from default to View, you'll now see that it has changed. It's really noticeable if we orbit the camera around the object. We'll get more into manipulating the camera later. This tool lets me rotate around an axis coming straight out of the camera through the center of the object. There are also different tool settings for the different modes. Again, it would be a lot to go over, so just have some fun with it for now. Now, if I could bring your attention to the drop-down menu over here on the far right, we have some options to change how the tool settings work. These are context sensitive based on the mode. So to summarize, we have tools that do things, we have tool settings that affect the tools, and we have options that affect the tool settings. The next section you'll want to get familiar with is the transform controls. These controls are always on the screen regardless of what tool you have selected, so they won't do anything for some tools. The first drop-down menu lets you change the transform orientation. It works exactly like the previous one, except the previous one has a higher priority. In the previous one, default means it'll do whatever is in the transform controls, but anything other than default means it will override the transform controls. So if we select default, it'll use whatever is selected here. But if we select one of these, it'll ignore whatever is selected here. The next drop-down menu lets you change the pivot point. To demonstrate this, I'll add a few more cubes real quick. The default transform pivot point is median point, which in object mode uses the geometric center of all objects. On a technical level, it adds up all the x values for all the objects we have selected and takes the average to get the x value of the pivot point. Then it does the same thing to get the y and z values. In other words, it finds the center of gravity. However, since it uses the geometric center, which is something we can define, it can lead to some counterintuitive results. For example, if I move the origin of this cube out to here and select all of our cubes, you'll see that the pivot point is not between the objects like how you would expect. These also work on a per vertex, edge, and face level in edit mode as well. Moving on, we have the snapping tool. We can turn it on by clicking this magnetic icon. These let us snap to increments or elements of other objects. They work in both object and edit mode. You can change if they affect movement, rotation, or scale. The final tool we have in the controls section is proportional editing. This lets us move vertices, edges, or faces around a selection smoothly. So for example, we can select one vertex, but smoothly control the vertices around it. This is usually used in edit mode. However, it does work on objects too. Let me set up a scene so we can demo it real quick. Here I have a plane which I've subdivided just a few times so we can have some points to work with. With proportional editing turned on, if I select a vertex and move it up in the z-axis, you can see the proportional editing in action. The fallout type changes how it fades out. If I move over here, I can show you the other example. This shows you how it works on the per object level. It basically treats the origin of each object like it was treating the vertices in the previous example. Now let's move on to display and shading. The first thing we're greeted with is this menu that lets us show or hide different types of objects. This will become useful when you start working on larger projects. For example, you might be working on a large project that has all sorts of lights, cameras, and speakers, and they are distracting you from your work. Turning them off will help you focus. Just don't freak out and assume all your lights got deleted. Always check that they aren't hidden first. Next to that, we have this menu that lets us show or hide UI elements that overlay the viewport. So say, for example, we got tired of looking at this navigation gizmo. We can turn it off by unchecking this first checkbox. I don't like to use the navigation gizmo. It's a lot easier for me to use the shortcuts, so I'll turn mine off and free up that screen real estate. I wouldn't mess with these too much unless you have a specific reason. Some of these hide very important things like the transformation gizmos. So if we unchecked active tools, pick the move tool, select an object, you'll see that we don't get the gizmo needed to move the object around. I've been doing computer graphics on and off since 2004, and I can't think of a single reason why you wouldn't want to see the gizmo. I'm sure some people use it for very specific cases, but we don't need to worry about that for now. If you know what people use this for, please let me know. Next to that, we have a menu that lets us show or hide viewport elements that live inside the viewport, such as the floor and axis lines. This menu is context sensitive based on what mode you are in. So, for example, if we select edit mode, in the lower portion, we get options related to edit mode. Going back to the top for a second, we can turn the floor on and off. I'll keep it on for now. You'll notice we have an X and Y axis, but no Z. That's because it's turned off in this menu. The top half of the menu is always the same, from the top to motion tracking. Past that, it'll change based on what mode you're in, so have a look around in there. Some gems I know of are if you go to edit mode, you can turn on measurements. This tells you things like how long your edges are. These lengths are by default in local space, which means they can differ from their true size. If you always want them to be accurate, you can set them to global space by making sure your side panel is out with the N key and make sure you're on the item tab and click global. But this is getting a little ahead of ourselves. The next 5 buttons in a drop-down menu are grouped together, and that's because they all do something similar. They change the shading of our objects. The drop-down menu at the end is context sensitive based on these 4 buttons next to it. The X-ray button is a little bit of an oddball. It lets us see through the object. Since it can work regardless of what shading mode we're in, it's separated from the shading buttons. X-ray isn't just for looks either. It affects how selections work too. If we keep the X-ray setting disabled and go to edit mode and make sure we're selecting for vertices and then draw a box around our object, you might think we have all of the vertices, but you'd be dead wrong. We only get the vertices on the side we're looking at. However, if we enable X-ray mode, we get all the vertices. This will of course apply to edges and faces as well. The next 4 buttons, as I've said, are our shading buttons. There's wireframe, solid, material preview, and rendered shading. Wireframe doesn't have any shading at all, but its drop-down menu has some options that let us do cool stuff like randomize the colors. Solid shading attaches a virtual light off to the side, and it's locked to your virtual viewport camera, although you can change this in the drop-down menu. You can think of this as a flashlight strapped to a coal miner's hat. It follows the worker around and lets them see. You can also change how the shading looks by selecting some of the built-in shaders or just how the light behaves. I find this shading style the most useful for everyday use, and it will probably be the one you'll find yourself using the most. I tend not to use the others unless I have a very specific selection I'm trying to make or I'm about to render a model. The material preview will show you what your actual objects look like with the material you have assigned to it. Since it currently has the default material, it'll show up as white. Rendered shading will render the viewport using whatever rendering engine you have selected. We currently have the Eevee render engine selected, but we can change that. However, before you do, please note that the Cycle engine is very resource intensive on your computer. If you have a slow computer, it might make yours very slow. Turning mine on will cause all my fans to spin faster, as you might be able to hear in the background. We can turn it on by resetting the 3D viewport with Control Spacebar and go into the Property Editor, clicking this Render tab, and changing our render engine to Cycles. This gives us a good preview of what our final render will look like if we decided to use Cycles for our final renderer. I'll undo all that for now.
Bruh.
And finally, we have the side panel, also known as the end panel within the Blender community. This has an item tab which lets us manipulate the transform of the currently selected object, which could be a vertex, an edge, a face, or an actual object. The Tools tab shows us some properties related to our current tool. And the View lets us change things about the viewport camera, which is not an actual camera. One of my favorite things from this View tab is this option called Camera to View. To use it, first select a camera in your scene and press 0 on the number pad. That will make the viewport camera match the transform of the camera you have selected. If we take Camera to View, moving the viewport camera will move the selected camera. There are other ways of doing this, but this is the best way I could find since this method lets you see the frame around your camera. This will probably make more sense later, but I just want to throw it out there for now. Well guys, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new. Subscribe to join me in the next video, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye guys.